There is a problem that, while not unique to event sourcing, does become more prominent when we start using it. And it's a problem that we have to understand so that we know how to work around it. The problem is that when we start doing event sourcing, usually if we're doing something like domain-driven design, we would event source our aggregates or our entities. Basically, our entities or aggregate roots would create events. Those events are then persisted. Now, the problem is, if we think about this from the perspective of, say, our reactive barbecue reservation system, in the reactive barbecue reservation system, our aggregate might be a reservation. And for many purposes, that's maybe okay. But in some cases, we end up in a situation where we need to perform a query that can't actually be answered by a single aggregate root. So if I want to know things like what time is a reservation at, I can get that from the reservation aggregate root. If I want to know who was the reservation for, I can get that for the reservation aggregate root. But what happens if I want to do something more complicated? So here's an example where I want to do get reservations by customer. So now I have the customer's name or ID or whatever, and I want to get all of the reservations for that customer. Well, if reservation is the aggregate root, then reservation can't answer that question. And now we end up in a problem. In order to actually answer that question, what I would have to do is I would have to go through and rebuild potentially every reservation in the system from the log, and then check if those reservations have the correct customer and then use them. That's a lot of work. Having to rebuild all of them from scratch just to get a small subset is way more work than we want to do. We can't just do a simple database query like a join or a complicated query of any kind, because the data in the database is all stored in events. It's not stored as the current state. So this becomes a problem. Now, the problem is that we have conflicting models in our system. In truth, this problem happens when we use event sourcing, but it can happen even if we don't use event sourcing. The problem is that we have said that our aggregate root is a reservation. Whether we're using event sourcing or not, the aggregate root is going to be the reservation. That's great for commands like create reservation. But for queries such as get reservations for customer, things get awkward. And again, they're awkward whether we use event sourcing or not, because even if we don't use event sourcing, we still have to query every reservation in order to figure out whether it's got the correct customer, assuming we are going through the aggregate root. And if we're not going through the aggregate root, then we're not really using domain-driven design, and that's a different issue. So how do we solve this problem? How do we deal with the fact that we have conflicting models? In one case, for create reservation, the best aggregate root is the reservation. In another case, like get reservations for customer, a better aggregate root might be customer. We could go get the customer aggregate root, and then we could get all the reservations. How do we resolve these conflicts? The fact of the matter is that the model that you use to persist is often not compatible with the model that you want to use for queries. And so in the next section of the course, we're going to get into a solution to this problem.